Today you'll hear about something that most people don't think about. How the watershed affects the Blue Hills and how the Blue Hills affects the surrounding area. I'm Judy Lara Jacobs, the Executive Director of the Friends, of the Blue Hills. And hold on one second. I'm going to turn it around. The Executive Director of the Friends of the Blue Hills, and I am with
Ian Cook, and I'm the Executive Director of the Neponset River Watershed Association.
Great. So you are watching Blue Hills Alive, your weekly guide to the Blue Hills, and we thank our sponsor, Tom O'Neill of Success Realty in Milton. If you have gone and enjoyed some of the resources in our watershed, please let us know. Like if you have swam in the ponds or taken a boat to the Neponset River, we would love to know. And if you'd like to explore the Blue Hills, you can download a guide at friendsofthebluehills.org/guide, and the link is in the comments. So we're going to start. Now it's sound on.
All right, sound on helps.
You've been with the Neponset River Watershed Association for decades, right?
Yeah, it's starting to be a long time. It's a little over 20 years now.
So we probably still have one. But why don't you start and tell us a little bit about your background?
So I have spent actually most of my career now working at the Neponset Watershed Association in lots of different capacities. And it's been a lot of fun. You know, the Watershed Association really works on cleaning up and protecting the river, the tributaries along the river, the wetlands, open spaces throughout the entire watershed area. So it's a lot of issues, a lot of fun, a lot of wonderful people I've gotten a chance to work with over the years.
That's great. So do you want to start with the basics? What is the watershed and how does it affect the Blue Hills?
Sure. So a watershed is, and many people are confused about this, but a watershed is the area of land that drains into a particular river. So a lot of people think the watershed is the water, but it's actually the land. So in the case of the Neponset River watershed, the watershed includes parts of 14 cities and towns, starting in Foxborough and running all the way down to the southern edge of Boston and Quincy, and as far east as a little bit of Randolph and Stoughton, and over to Medfield and Dover. So basically, anytime it rains, anywhere inside the watershed area, eventually that rain and water will make its way into the Neponset River, past us here, the Neponset River off to the side, and down to Boston Harbor, where the river meets the harbor next to the painted gas tank by the expressway. So that's kind of what the watershed is. The reason we call ourselves the Watershed Association and think about trying to manage environmental issues on a watershed basis is because when you think about all the different sources of water pollution, issues of water supply, all those water issues within a single watershed are connected. So we have about 330,000 people that live in the Neponset watershed, all of whom are going about their daily business and have homes and septic systems and sewers and parking lots and all the kinds of things that can contribute pollutants to the river and to the watershed. And we also we also have about 120,000 people that get their drinking water from groundwater sources under the Neponset watershed. So keeping all of the water sorted out is an important thing, and it really kind of operates on the basis of where the water wants to flow. In terms of the role of the Blue Hills in the Neponset watershed, one of the most important strategies for keeping a river healthy, keeping your drinking water clean, is to protect land in a natural state. And certainly the Blue Hills Reservation is really the single largest chunk of protected undeveloped land in the watershed. And you've got all kinds of things happening in the Blue Hills, like plants and funguses and trees and soil that are getting rained on, absorbing that water, cleaning it up, filtering it, helping to recharge it back into the ground, and providing a nice steady flow of clean water contributing to the river. So that's kind of the most obvious way that the Blue Hills affect the river, and vice versa. Of course, the Blue Hills, because the watershed is the land, the Blue Hills are in the watershed. So it's not so much that the watershed affects the Blue Hills, but the Blue Hills are the watershed. So.
Right. And we're part of another watershed as well.
Yes, the Blue Hills does, often the boundaries between watersheds are on the tops of hills. That kind of makes sense. So parts of the Blue Hills drain into the Blue Hill River, appropriately named, including Houghton's Pond. Drains towards the Blue Hill River, which is ultimately flows into the Fore River.
Great. And does it matter that there's two watersheds in the Blue Hills? Like, does it may have any effect?
Not particularly. I mean, it may change the way you want to manage things in the Blue Hills. It may change where certain kinds of wetlands or water bodies are. But, there's no particular drawback to having two watersheds instead of one.
Good. So there is a comment probably telling us that we couldn't hear you before. Volume, exactly. So that was the comment, and so we also would like to know if you which watershed you live in. So if you know, you can write it in the comments, and if you don't, you can just write the town you live in, and Ian can tell you what watershed you live in. So what does it mean to have a healthy watershed?
Well, from our point of view, a healthy watershed is one that's got clean water, right? So the river is, under the Federal Clean Water Act, is supposed to meet fishable, swimmable water quality standards. A healthy watershed should also have what we would refer to as natural stream flows, right? So it shouldn't, overflow and cause massive flooding when it's raining out. It shouldn't, dry up and turn into a trickle during the summer when things are dry out. You want to have a relatively natural flow, and there's a lot of things that humans do as we develop a watershed that affects the amount of water that's in the river. Another important factor in a healthy watershed is having protected open space and natural land to serve as habitat for fish and wildlife and birds and so forth. So we spend a lot of time sort of worrying about habitat issues. You also, in the Neponset watershed, have a number of issues with other things that have been done to the river over the years. So the river has been dammed. There's actually more than 100 dams in the Neponset and its tributaries. There are places where the river has been channelized or where its floodplain has been filled in, and really we'd like to have those natural functions continue to operate. So we spend a lot of time working on trying to restore some of those natural features that have been lost over the years.
That's great. And obviously the Blue Hills is part of that open space, so we're making it healthy.
Exactly. Yeah, the Blue Hills is, from the point of view of a watershed association, the Blue Hills is wonderful because it's not that there's nothing to worry about in the Blue Hills, but there's less to worry about in the Blue Hills. We can feel confident. Nobody's going to build a giant mall on top of Blue Hill. So
we hope not.
We don't, hopefully not. It'd be pretty hard to do. Everybody
sure
would be very
to.
mad if somebody tried to do that.
Absolutely.
So
good. So we just had a series of storms. Why would the Blue Hills be particularly important in terms of flooding or management?
Sure. So again, when you think about flooding and you think about a watershed, so you have a big storm, you've got this huge area. The Neponset watershed includes about 120 square miles of land that's all ultimately funneling down into the Neponset River. And that's, if you think about 2 or 3 inches of rain over 120 square miles, that's a lot of water. And it can cause flooding. Having areas like the Blue Hills that are protected in a natural state helps to greatly absorb and slow down some of that water. You know, when we build things like parking lots, when rain hits the parking lot, it hits the parking lot, shoots right off, and it gets into the river within a couple of minutes. So the flow level and the water depth in the river gets high very quickly when there's a lot of that kind of pavement around. By having protected open spaces where you've got trees and natural soils and wetlands and other features, those natural features tend to intercept and absorb the water and slow it down and release it very slowly, and it kind of trickles out, and so the peak height of the river doesn't get too high and doesn't spill over and start causing flooding. And Fowl Meadow, although it's not, I actually think of Fowl Meadow as being part of the Blue Hills, even though I'm not sure it technically is, but
it's on the map. It's part of it.
That's right.
We own it.
So it's Fowl Meadow. So the Blue Hills is obviously the hill, you know, Great Blue Hill, and then the meadow is kind of like the flat spot at the bottom of Blue Hill. And part of what happens in Fowl Meadow is it's a large area of almost 8,000 acres that's now designated as a state area of critical environmental concern. And historically, this part of the river, it's kind of in the middle of the watershed. And historically, it was a glacial lake, so it's really flat. If you think about like what bottom of a lake, the sand and the dirt spreads out and gets nice and flat. So we now that the lake is gone, we have the river running through the middle of this big flat area that's still very natural. You know, we've got lots of trees, lots of marshes, swamp kind of environments, and it's an area that's what's called a floodplain. So when it floods, the water in the river can start to rise, and it starts to spread out across the floodplain on either side of the river. And the benefit of that is that the floodplain acts like sort of a sponge or a storage area, so that water can come into the floodplain in Fowl Meadow. It can kind of spread out and hang out there for a bit before it gets slowly released downstream to Boston. And we actually saw, there's a couple places where the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, monitors using automated equipment the amount of water going by at different spots in the Neponset River. And you could see in this last storm that there's kind of one gauge up in Norwood, you know, that kind of drains that part of the watershed. And there was like, I'm not sure I have the numbers right, but something like over like 900 cubic feet of water per second coming out of Norwood, just upstream of Fowl Meadow. And then there's another branch of the river upstream of Fowl Meadow called the East Branch of the Neponset River that comes out of Canton. And that was flowing at, you know, maybe it was on the same order, 800, 900 cubic feet per second. And all that water was coming together down into the Fowl Meadow. But if you looked at the stream gauge at the outlet end of Fowl Meadow, so we had 1,800 cubic feet of water. It was like 1,800 basketballs per second coming into the Fowl Meadow. And on the outgoing end, where the river sort of comes out of the Fowl Meadow and heads downstream to Boston, there was only 500 cubic feet per second of water coming out. So the Fowl Meadow was sort of absorbing that peak flow and really protecting the city. You know, if 1,800 cubic feet was hitting the city, it would be pretty ugly because people would be flooded out. But by protecting the Fowl Meadow, we've sort of helped to protect some of the development downstream.
That's a great example. Thank you. What about all the snow? How does that affect the watershed? I'm always surprised when it's, you know, there's a drought and people say that it's not going to be affected when the snow melts.
I think snow is a great thing. I mean, one of the things that's nice about snow is obviously it sits on the ground and then it melts, and it all happens a little more slowly than a rainstorm usually. And one of the things that you really want to have happen in your watershed is you want, you know, either small rainstorms that just give you just a little bit of rain, or sort of snowpack that will sort of slowly melt so that water can percolate into the ground and to help to recharge the underground water storage that helps keep the river flowing during the summer. You know, if you ever wonder, like, well, it hasn't rained in a month, why is there any water at all in the Neponset River? It's because groundwater is seeping out into the river all through the summer, and it's in the spring and the winter when the recharge happens to help bring the water table up and refill our underground reservoirs, and then we'll slowly leak out into the river for the next of the summer. rest of the summer and tide us through the drought. So it doesn't prevent a drought per se, if we have a lot of snow, but it does help recharge our reserves and get us ready for the next drought.
And you don't want the big storms because it'll just be surface water, run off. Is that why you prefer
in a bigger
smaller
storm? Yeah. So and this is really one of the big challenges with climate change in New England, particularly. The size of rainfall events we're getting has already changed more in New England than any place else in the country. So historically, we got almost all of our annual rainfall in a series of mostly pretty small rainfall events. Like we'd get a quarter inch of rain, like 70 days a year, and that adds up to a lot of our annual rainfall. And what's happening is more and more we're getting the same amount of rain on an annual average, but we're getting it in bigger slugs. So if you get a quarter inch of rain, you might not have any runoff, and it might all percolate into the ground. If you get an inch of rain, well, maybe half of it will run off and rush off in a big flood in one storm event. If you get 8 inches of rain in one storm event, some of it will percolate into the ground, but 7 inches of it is going to end up rushing right off into the river, causing flooding downstream and not really recharging your system. So definitely having those smaller storms, those sort of events that let things kind of slowly percolate, is really good from an environmental standpoint. And the change in our rainfall pattern is one of the big challenges that's going to be an increasing issue as the climate continues to change.
It's a good connection. So what about the development that surrounds the Blue Hills? How does the Blue Hills affect? What's my question? How does the development affect the Blue Hills in terms of the watershed?
So certainly one of the biggest, historically on the Neponset River, we had lots of early water-powered industry along the river, and with that came lots of, just kind of what you think of as big industrial discharges that really made the river not very clean back in the 40s and the 50s. Most of those kinds of industrial discharges, in fact, almost all of them, have now been cleaned up, thanks to the Federal Clean Water Act. The biggest water quality, water pollution challenge that remains in the Neponset watershed is all of us, right? We all have homes, we all have driveways, we have lawns, we have, we shop places that have parking lots. So there's an enormous amount of, basically pavement, and the technical term for it is impervious surface. Basically places where water used to soak into the ground because it was forest, like the Blue Hills, and now it's not forest, so it doesn't soak into the ground anymore. And when it rains on those impervious surfaces, there's dog poop, oil, fertilizer, sand. There can be little particles that rub off your tires. All that sort of stuff that gets onto the pavement gets rinsed clean by the rain. And unfortunately, and that's great if you want to have a clean parking lot, it's not so great because the river, then that water then goes right into the river and carries the pollution with it. So one of the biggest challenges that the development presents to the river is that polluted stormwater runoff. And we spend a lot of time trying to work with municipalities to get them to make sure that developers are installing equipment to intercept that runoff and clean it up before it gets sent to the river. And we spend a lot of time working with residents to raise their awareness of what they can do to help avoid creating stormwater pollution, because a lot of people don't understand. People see the storm drain in their street, that little sort of iron grate thing, and they think, oh, I've never really thought about what that is or where it goes. A lot of people assume that goes to some sort of treatment plant or someplace it gets cleaned up, and occasionally that's true, but almost every time you see a storm drain in the Neponset watershed, whatever goes in there, whatever washes off the street and goes in there, is going to immediately be piped straight to the nearest stream or wetland, along with all the pollution it contains. So raising public awareness of that, if you're fertilizing your lawn, make sure you don't get any fertilizer on any pavement anywhere, because you might as well be pouring it directly into the river. Pet waste, we need to pick up pet waste and dispose of it appropriately in a trash can. You'll never put it in a storm drain. Occasionally we hear stories from our DPWs. They'll find a storm drain where somebody has been diligently picking up their pet waste back, and then on their way home they stop and they just tuck it in the storm drain. Say, oh, this is sort of like a trash can, this storm drain. We'll just get rid of this here, and then I won't have to carry it. But in fact, that's going right into the river, and people don't realize. So getting that word out is important.
Good. Well, you just did.
Good. Excellent. All right.
So we'd love to know your comments. We think we have some. So Liz Irons Young says, oh, you still no volume? Really? Not good.
Turned on here?
I don't know. Can you hear us now? Or is it just gone? Should we see? We can't tell when. If you can hear us, let us know. Because he's been talking about great stuff. Should we just continue on? We're just going to assume that it's going to keep going. Maybe Liz can tell us. Still no bond. Perhaps you will have this written. If we haven't recorded it, we won't have it written.
Is it supposed to have a light on?
Yeah, it is.
No, maybe that's on. It's hard to tell. It's so bright out.
Let's see if somebody else.
I have a light on.
Yes, I can hear. Yay! Thank you, Mary.
Right.
Thank you very much for letting us know. So we'll continue. Woohoo! Thanks, Ian. We're good. So you guys can let us know if you have any questions, especially about the part that you didn't hear. She says it's perfect. Thank you. Was that Mary again? Oh no, that was. I can't read your name. Lucians. What was it? Luciano. Oh, thank you. Okay, good. So we're looking at Fowl Meadow, and I'm going to try and turn this camera to see if you might be able to see it. Okay, I'm going to turn it later because I'm afraid of messing with it. Anyway, behind us is Fowl Meadow, and I think you already talked about this. Why Fowl Meadow is really important. Maybe you cover that. What about some of the threats to Fowl Meadow? You talked about some.
I talked a little bit about stormwater, which is one of the big
Not all
challenges.
There's more.
Yep. Another big challenge in Fowl Meadow is water withdrawals. Again, I mentioned that a surprising number of people get their drinking water from groundwater sources under and along the river. And another thing we're really urging people to do is to try to conserve water, because the amount of water that's withdrawn from those groundwater sources can have a real effect on the amount of water that's left in the river in the summer. And of course, Fowl Meadow is probably the single biggest underground groundwater aquifer anywhere in the watershed. It holds, I think it's supposedly 95 billion gallons of water. But the tricky part is, even though it's got all that water, you don't have to lower the water level very much before it starts affecting the river. And obviously, if you're out wanting to go canoeing, or if you're a fish trying to live in the river, you need there to be water there. And when we divert it for household use, especially any sort of unnecessary or inefficient household use, it has a really big impact on the health of the river. So that's another big threat. Most of Fowl Meadow is now protected through public ownership as part of the Blue Hills Reservation, or by DCR, or by, in some cases, towns. There are still a few spots around the edge of Fowl Meadow, though, that are privately owned. We actually saw DCR make some very important acquisitions just across the way in Milton here the last couple of years that we're very pleased to see. But filling in those missing bits of protection before they get developed is another very important consideration.
Huh. And you haven't mentioned invasives, but you guys have worked on
Yes, invasive species are always a challenge. Yes, we have lots of challenges with those. All over the Blue Hills, both in the meadow and up on the hill. Here in Fowl Meadow, over the last I think we finished this 2 or 3 years ago. We worked with a lot of volunteers through what we called our beetle ranching program to try to raise a particular kind of beetle that likes to eat purple loosestrife, which is one of the big invasive plants here. But even standing right here, we can see, we've got some Phragmites over there. We've got other invasives around, and that's a huge challenge as well.
And in terms of the watershed, how does an invasives affect the water quality, or?
The invasives, in most cases, don't tend to actually affect water quality. I mean, from a water quality standpoint, kind of any plant is probably a good plant. But from a habitat standpoint, they're a very large impact. So, the invasive species, our native insects and wildlife and other species have sort of evolved over time in concert with the native plants that we have, and they're very dependent on those plant communities to provide the habitats that they need to survive. So when we have these invasive species that come in that don't help provide those habitat functions the same way, it can have a very big impact on the ecology of the watershed.
Right. Okay, so you wanted to talk about dams as well. I think you already did a little bit, but you want to talk about your the project that you're working on?
Sure. We do have a little project we're working on right now over on the other side of the Blue Hills, along Pine Tree Brook, near Unquity Road and sort of behind the Ewan Rink, where the headwaters of Pine Tree Brook, which people know, if you're familiar with Milton, you sort of know Pine Tree Brook makes its way all the way through Milton. But the headwaters of Pine Tree Brook are in the Blue Hills Reservation, or parts of them are also protected in the Milton Town Forest or some privately owned conservation land. And as a result, the headwaters of the brook are really, the habitat is beautiful, and they do something very unusual, which is they support a wild breeding population of wild brook trout, which are becoming very, very rare in eastern Massachusetts. In fact, if you look at a map of brook trout habitat across the state, the brook trout habitat that exists in the headwaters of Pine Tree Brooks is closer to the city of Boston than any other remaining trout population anywhere in the state. So what we're doing over there is there are 3 very small dams near the headwaters of Pine Tree Brook that create barriers that keep the fish from being able to migrate upstream and downstream, and really limit the available stream habitat for them. So we've been working with volunteers over the last couple of years to essentially modify those structures so that they're fish passable. And just the other day, as part of that, we're doing some invasive species control work to try to make sure that the things we're doing that are changing water levels aren't going to allow a few little starting colonies of invasive species to spread. So
that's great. Thinking ahead, to you, let's see. Do you want to talk about how people can enjoy the watershed? Where they can put in boats?
Absolutely.
That sort of thing.
So, certainly the Blue Hills is, aside from being the biggest area of protected land, which we like from a water quality and groundwater recharge standpoint, it's also far and away the biggest sort of recreational open space in the watershed. But we're very lucky in the Neponset that we have a lot of protected open land. We've got, aside from the Blue Hills, we've got Fowl Meadow, which is a lovely place to come take a walk. We've now got the Neponset Greenway Trail, which runs almost, but not quite, to the Blue Hills in Hyde Park, down through Dorchester and Milton and Mattapan and out to the Boston Gas Tank, which has been a wonderful resource. We've got great parks like Farnham Conley Park up in Canton, which opened just a few years ago, DCR Park. Wonderful private reservations like the Moose Hill Wildlife Sanctuary. And of course the river itself is a lovely place to go to explore if you have a canoe or a kayak, to go out and poke around either in the inland part of the river or down in the estuary where it's salt water and salt marshes, and sometimes we have eagles. the Watershed Association actually not long ago published a new paddling guide to the river. If you're trying to figure out where you can put a canoe on the river, it's sometimes hard to figure out. The Friends of Blue Hills obviously have a great guide to the many features of the Blue Hills. And we've got on our website, we've got a few of the other parks in the watershed highlighted. Although we've always aspired to have a comprehensive outdoor recreation guide for the Neponset watershed. We've never quite managed to do that. It's still on the to-do list. But
you want to say what your website is?
Sure. It's just neponset.org.
Good. And other questions? Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think we've covered a lot of territory.
We certainly have.
I mean, we do have. One other thing that we do like to do is, when people go out to the river, we want the water to actually be, chemically clean, so that people feel like they can go canoeing or, in some places, even swimming. The river is actually a lot cleaner than most people think. Probably we have volunteers who collect water quality samples 6 times a year all over the watershed at 41 locations, and probably about 80% at least of the places where we collect samples, at least during dry weather when you're not getting that runoff from roads and parking lots, actually meet swimmable water quality standards. So, aside from wanting the water to be clean, we also, parts of the river have really suffered from neglect and dumping over the years. So one of the things we've been doing is slowly but surely trying to organize volunteers to do river cleanups. So we have a river cleanup coming up at the end of April at a variety of sites all over the watershed. So love to get people out and volunteer, much as the Friends of Blue Hills do on many of their projects. So that's my one little plug I'll throw.
That's awesome. Maybe we can try and put a link to the event in the comments. And let's see if there's other people who have questions. Not now, but if you are watching this later, just put your questions in the comments below. And thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Blue Hills Alive, your weekly guide to the Blue Hills. And we thank our sponsor, Tom O'Neill of Success Realty in Milton, for sponsoring these weekly videos at Thursday at noon. Thank you for putting up with little sound in the very beginning. And if you wanted to get the guide to the Blue Hills, the link is in the comments. And you can go to friendsofthebluehills.org/video. And we'll see you next Thursday when we will be going to Brookwood Farm, which is where we were trying to go last week when it was too snowy. So we'll see you then.